step back more than 160 years to a nation torn apart by war. These haunting portraits of Confederate soldiers, once frozen in black and white, now return in striking color through careful digital restoration. Every crease in a uniform, every glint of brass, and every determined gaze comes alive again. These are not just faces from a history book. They were sons, brothers, and fathers whose lives were forever changed by the Civil War. Join us as we travel through time to witness their world as they might have seen it. Lucien Love, a member of the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry, was one of the 6 Mosby's men executed by Union troops at Front Royal, Virginia, in 1864. The executions were ordered by Union General George Custer in retaliation for the death of a Union officer who was allegedly killed after he had surrendered. Love's execution was part of a broader pattern of executions by Mosby's Rangers, which were retaliatory actions taken by Union forces against captured Union soldiers. The executions were carried out on the orders of General George A. Custer, who was involved in the 1864 Valley Campaign. The historical marker for the executions of Mosby's men is located near Front Royal, Virginia, and provides a glimpse into the events that led to these tragic executions. Stone Sentinels. Thomas E. Anderson Cody, one of the 6 Mosby's men killed at Front Royal by Custer's command. Lieutenant William Bowen Gallagher accompanied 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment in uniform and Virginia State seal belt plate with a revolver and cavalry sword. Colonel Taylor, circa 1864. When people talk about the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, they usually mention General Robert E. Lee, but behind Lee's calm confidence was a young officer who kept the Army moving like clockwork. Walter H. Taylor. Born in Norfolk, Virginia, in 1838, Taylor was only 23 when the Civil War erupted. He began as a humble aide-de-camp, but Lee quickly noticed his sharp mind and unshakable composure. While cannon fire thundered and messengers rushed in with chaotic reports, Taylor was a man who turned chaos into clarity. He organized troop movements, drafted Lee's famous orders, and handled critical intelligence. Soldiers joked that Taylor could find a missing brigade with nothing more than a pencil and a calm stare. Even in the heat of Gettysburg, when confusion reigned, Taylor's handwriting shaped the very plans that defined the battle. Despite his influence, Taylor was never a glory seeker. He survived the war, returned to Norfolk, and quietly built a career as a banker and city leader. Later, he wrote detailed accounts of Lee's campaigns. History is so precise that modern scholars still rely on them. Walter H. Taylor wasn't a household name, but without him, Robert E. Lee's legendary army might have been a disorganized mess. He proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is a clear head and a steady hand. 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion Lieutenant Col Legay White. Legay White and the Gray Comanches. Another rare carte de visite of Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Veers, Legay White, the commander of the 35th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry. Lieutenant Colonel White was one of the most distinguished cavalry leaders to serve in the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. A native of Poolesville, Maryland, and subsequent resident of Leesburg, Virginia, Legay White initially fought under Brigadier General Turner Ashby Jr. in Company C of the 7th Virginia Cavalry Regiment. In recognition of invaluable services rendered during the Battle of Ball's Bluff, Virginia, on October 21st, 1861, White received a captain's commission and was authorized to raise an independent company for border patrol duties along the Potomac River, primarily organized as an irregular partisan outfit for operations in Loudoun County, Virginia. Lieutenant Colonel White's 35th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry was eventually mustered into regular service and assigned to Brigadier General William E. Grumble Jones' famed Laurel Brigade. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Colonel White and his doughty horsemen won an enviable reputation within the Army for their fearsome hand-to-hand combat abilities, which inspired Confederate Major General Thomas L. Rosser to dub them the Comanches. The 35th Virginia Cavalry captured a Federal artillery battery from New York during the Battle of Brandy Station, but the Federals recovered the cannons. In his official report of the Battle of Parker's Store, Virginia, which took place on November 29, 1863, Confederate Major General J.E.B. Stuart specifically singled out the 35th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry for their gallant conduct. I have never seen dead bodies more thickly strewn than they were in the small thicket in front of White's men. That great cavalry chieftain, Confederate Lieutenant General Wade Hampton III, also admiringly wrote that the Comanches were well known for their wild charges, together with their blood-chilling yells when they encountered any Union forces. I never called on White when he did not ride over everything in sight. Lieutenant Colonel White confidently posed for this portrait in full Confederate uniform at the photographic studio of D.G. Alexander of Leesburg, Virginia. Photograph of Fredericksburg taken in 1863. In the foreground can be seen the Excelsior Mill and the ruins of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad Bridge. In the distance, you can see Brompton. 1864 photograph of Cadet Overton. Cadet Archibald Waller Overton was 18 years old when he fought at the Battle of New Market. He served in the artillery unit as a private in Company C of the VMI Corps Cadets. In the months leading up to the Battle of New Market, Cadet Overton corresponded with a friend about rumors the cadets were hearing and passing around the barracks. It is said that no furloughs will be granted this summer. There was another rumor last week that we were going on a march. Numerous others are afloat, but as I said before, to enumerate them would take more time than I have at my disposal. Co-K 1st Virginia Cavalry W.M. Henry Dorsey. Sally Louisa Tompkins was a Confederate nurse and the first woman to have been formally inducted into an army in American history. In the heart of the Civil War, while cannons roared and soldiers fell, one woman quietly earned a rank no other woman in Confederacy would ever hold: Captain Sally Tompkins. Born into Virginia's aristocracy in 1833, Sally was expected to live a life of comfort, but when war erupted in 1861, she turned her Richmond home into a hospital for wounded Confederate soldiers. Unlike the overcrowded, disease-ridden hospitals of the time, Tompkins demanded order and cleanliness. She washed floors herself, boiled instruments, and insisted on fresh air and sunlight. Decades before modern germ theory was common, her results were astonishing. While other hospitals lost patients to infection and neglect, Sally Tompkins' death rate was the lowest in the entire Confederacy. Word of her success reached President Jefferson Davis, who wanted to close all private hospitals for efficiency. But there was one problem. No Army hospital matched Tompkins' record. So Davis did something remarkable. He commissioned her as a captain in Confederate Army, making her the only woman officially ranked in Confederate military service. Captain Tompkins never carried a sword or fired a shot. Her weapon was compassion. By war's end, more than 1,300 soldiers had passed through her hospital's doors, and countless lives were saved because she refused to accept anything less than excellence. After the war, Sally lived quietly, never seeking fame or fortune. But to the men she healed, she was more than a nurse. She was a hero in gray, proof that courage isn't always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it's found in the steady hands of a woman with a will of steel. Captain Robert E. Lee, Jr. When people hear the name Robert E. Lee, they think of the famed Confederate general. But few know the story of his youngest son, Captain Robert E. Lee, Jr., a man who carried the weight of a legendary name into the chaos of the Civil War. Born in 1843 at Arlington House, Robert Jr., known to his family as Rob, grew up in the shadow of history. As war erupted, 3 of Lee's sons went to fight. Rob was the last to join, enlisting in 1862 at just 19. He served first as a private in the Rockbridge Artillery, later earning a captain's rank on his father's staff. Unlike his famous father, Rob wasn't a battlefield strategist. His war was one of mud, long rides, and endless danger. He carried messages through gunfire, inspected fortifications, and shared the hardships of ordinary soldiers. Despite his privileged upbringing, Rob earned the respect of the men around him for his modesty and courage. When the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, Rob returned home to a world turned upside down. The Lee family's Arlington estate had been seized and turned into what is now Arlington National Cemetery. Rather than chasing politics or military fame, Rob chose a quieter path: farming. He eventually bought a small property he called Romancoke. where he worked the land with his own hands. Years later, Robert E. Lee Jr. recorded his memories in a book titled Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee. It offered an intimate portrait of the great general, not as a distant hero, but as a father who teased his children, told stories by the fire, and worried about their futures. Rob Lee never sought the spotlight, but through his quiet service and heartfelt writings, he gave the world something priceless. A glimpse of Robert E. Lee the man, not just a myth. Cabinet card photo of the Chief Virginian Robert E. Lee with General Joseph Johnson, taken in 1870 in Savannah, GA. Co-E53rd Virginia Infantry, Captain Benjamin Lyons Farenholt, later Colonel VA Reserves. After being wounded and captured during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, Captain Benjamin Farenholt was sent to the federal prisoner of war camp on Johnson's Island in Ohio. There he and his fellow prisoner John Latane devised a daring escape plan. Latane somehow fashioned an imitation federal uniform, which Farenholt put on underneath his Confederate uniform. When the men were sent out on a work detail to break ice, Farenholt slipped off his Confederate clothes and walked away, right under the eyes of his guards. He made his way back to the lines of Virginia, and possibly in recognition of the trials he had already endured, was assigned command of the tiny garrison guarding the Stonen River Bridge, a place where he likely assumed he would not see action again. But in June 1864, General Grant dispatched a large force of 5,000 cavalry with instructions to destroy the bridge. When Farenholt received word that the raiders were coming, he recognized how desperate his situation was. It was absolutely essential that the bridge be held. If it was destroyed, the lifeline to Petersburg and Richmond would be severed. But he only had 296 men in his garrison, far too few to hold off the Federals. So Farenholt sent an urgent appeal throughout the surrounding Halifax and Charlotte County countryside, calling on any man who could shoulder a gun to join him at the bridge. In all, 642 citizens and soldiers answered Farenholt's call, guards from the Danville prisons, invalids, convalescing wounded, and soldiers home on furlough, along with about 500 local citizens, boys too young and men too old for regular service, bringing along whatever firearms they had. For this reason, the Battle of Stonen River Bridge is sometimes called a Battle of Old Men and Young Boys. For long afterwards, it was remembered locally as the day everybody went to the bridge to fight. The defenders dug in hastily and awaited the Federals' arrival. On the afternoon of June 25th, the Federal forces, 5,000 cavalry with 16 pieces of artillery, arrived and began shelling the bridge and the Confederate defenses. In the ensuing battle, the Federals charged the Confederate position 4 times and were each time driven back. Finally, with Confederate cavalry rapidly advancing on their rear, the Federals had to give up the attack. The bridge had been saved, and the local men and boys were welcomed home as heroes. Farenholt became a successful businessman after the war and died in King William County in 1919 at age 80. Lieutenant Charles L. Minor, 1835 to 1903, began his Civil War service with enlistment in 2nd Virginia Cavalry, Mumfords, in 1861, in which he served as a private at Manassas, in the Valley Campaign under Stonewall Jackson and the battles around Richmond. He was promoted by competitive examination to 2nd Lieutenant CA 1862 to 63, and was serving as aide-de-camp to General Albert G. Jenkins when the general/congressman was killed at the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain, May 9, 1864. General Sam Jones then claimed Minor and made him a captain in charge of ordnance at Charleston, South Carolina, from whence he was promoted further and saw his most significant service late in the war as the executive officer at the Richmond Arsenal under General Gorgas. After the war, Charles Minor served as president of what is now the University of Maryland and then became the founding president of what is now Virginia Tech, although he was removed from office after 8 years for getting into a fist fight with mathematics professor and former Confederate General James Henry Lane. 35th Virginia Partisan Cavalry Battalion, Lieutenant Col Elijah Veers Legay White, seated second from left. William H. Magan, 2nd Virginia Cavalry, enlisted in Company I, 2nd Cavalry Regiment, Virginia, on June 8, 1861. He made it out of Appomattox with his regiment, which disbanded at the Lynchburg Fairgrounds. He was paroled May 26, 1865 at Campbell Courthouse. Private William Anthony Holland of Company, K, 10th Virginia Cavalry Regiment with Bowie knife and Colt Army Model 1860 revolver. Born in Franklin County, Virginia on March 28, 1843. William was the fifth of 6 children born to Thomas J. and Miriam Smith Holland. The family lived on a prosperous tobacco, sheep, and grain farm located in the Glade Hill section of the county. William's grandfather, Major John M. Holland, served as a representative in the Virginia House of Delegates from 1820 to 1821, 1822 to 1824, 1826 to 1831, and 1834 to 1836. William's father died when he was 14, leaving him and his older brother, John Henry, age 15, to take over the responsibilities of running the farm and being there for their mother. At the age of 20, John Henry enlisted in the Confederate Army in Richmond on June 1, 1861, as a private in Company K, 10th Virginia Cavalry. William joined his older brother 1 year later at the age of 20 as a private in the same company. Company K was known as Rosser's Mounted Rangers, Virginia Rangers, or Texas Rangers. It was reorganized on May 25, 1862 under Captain James L. Dickinson and was one of the largest companies in the 10th Virginia Cavalry, with 265 men. The regiment was detached from the Wise Legion on May 28 and assigned to J.B. Stewart's brigade. The regiment was not actively engaged in the Battle of Seven Pines, but performed picket duty and acted as scouts and guides for General Longstreet. William is listed on the active duty roster for January 1st, 1863, and on June 6, 1863, it is noted that he had no horse. He was absent on horse detail on September 10, 1863, and present from November 1863 through April 1st, 1864. He was absent, sick leave on July 8, 1864. On September 30th and December 31st, 1864, he was issued clothing. He is listed on the post-war roster as being wounded in action and receiving a pension while living in Glade Hill. William married Lucinda Frances Smith, and they had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls: Mary Ellen Holland Martin, Nanny K. Holland Finney, Benjamin Thomas, John William, James Anthony, and Carrie Hampton Holland Caldwell. William Thomas bought the original family farm in 1850 and has remained in the family since that time. The house was built in 1798 by William Armistead Burwell. He would later sell the house when he became secretary to President Thomas Jefferson. The house was first owned by Thomas, then William, then Ben, then Floyd Holland. The house has been remodeled and is listed in the Virginia Landmarks Register. The property has also been recognized by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services as a Virginia Century. Hazel lived in the home until her death in 2005. She is buried on the property in the family cemetery beside her parents. William died January 17, 1935 at the age of 92. He is buried in the family cemetery on the property, and his grave is marked with a Confederate tombstone. Robert E. Lee and his faithful warhorse Traveler. Traveler was a gray American saddlebred of 16 hands, notable for speed, strength, and courage in combat. Lee acquired him in February 1862 and rode him in many battles. After the war, Traveler accompanied Lee to Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He lost many hairs from his tail to admirers, veterans, and college students who wanted a souvenir of the famous horse and his general. Lee wrote to his daughter Mildred Child Lee that the boys are plucking out his tail, and he is presenting the appearance of a plucked chicken. In 1870, during Robert E. Lee's funeral procession, Traveler was led behind the caisson bearing the general's casketed saddle and bridle draped with black crepe. Not long after Lee's death, in 1871, Traveler stepped on a nail and developed tetanus. There was no cure at the time, and he was put down to relieve his suffering. These restored photographs give us more than images. They give us a human connection to a distant past. If you enjoyed this journey into history, please like this video and subscribe for more incredible restorations of forgotten moments. Thank you for watching and for keeping history alive.